This is week 6 of our 7-week fall series where we've been working with this book up here called Falling Upward, A Spirituality for the Two Halves of Life by Richard Rohr. And just a quick review of what we're talking about here. This concept of the two halves of life is a metaphor that was created by the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, and it describes a developmental process that everyone goes through. It's something that goes from childhood and onward, so there's really no end to it, and it really describes how human beings grow and evolve and change, and especially at the level of consciousness. So one of the things that happens during the first half of life is that we establish an identity, and we all work hard to build up a positive self-image. We build up this face that we show to the world. And in Jungian psychology, this is called the persona, which comes from a Greek word which means mask. Now, this isn't to suggest that we're being phony or inauthentic. It just means that we're presenting an incomplete image. It's not the whole picture, so to speak, when we show this persona to the world. And it only becomes a problem when we make the mistake of thinking that the persona is the only thing that is. That's all that there is to us. We can create this beautiful mask, and we can think that it's really who we are and all that we are. And if we do that, we can block much needed growth and change. That's what can happen. Now, at an extreme level, we can use the persona to really hide behind. We can use it to actually hide anything that we might think of as being negative about us. Any sense of insecurity, pettiness, anger, jealousy, things like that. Those are the kind of things that we're reluctant to show to the world. They're things that we want to hide. And if we make a habit of doing that, if we make a habit out of ignoring and denying and disowning and repressing the things about ourselves that we don't like to see, well, those negative things can become even bigger problems for us later. Once again, Carl Jung came up with the word shadow to describe those things that we disown. The shadow is this collection of different aspects of ourself that we've tried to split off, that we reject, that we deny, that we refuse to look at because it's something that we don't want to acknowledge in ourselves. And the reason we do that, the reason we disown and reject those things is because it's often something that gained us the disapproval of others, especially mommy and daddy, right? As they say, if it ain't one thing, it's your mother or your father. But if I do this or say this, mommy won't love me or my friends won't accept me. I mean, peer pressure, peer approval, my goodness, that's powerful stuff. So we disown the behavior, we repress it, we deny that it's us. I don't do that. That's not me. We hide it behind this more positive and attractive persona that we've crafted. So that's how the two things work together. We deny it, we repress it, and yet it's still there. We drive it underground where it becomes unconscious or subconscious, and it keeps on doing its thing. And it can show up in our behavior in ways that we're often not even aware of. Now, other people can see this stuff, right? But often we're not aware of it. Psychologists call it the repressed unconscious. And really part of our spiritual work, especially during the latter stages of development, once we get done in the first stage of creating this beautiful mask, in the latter stages of development, we want to make those unconscious things we've tried to hide conscious again. We have to learn how to own those things, and if we don't, then we run the risk of being owned by them. Not a good thing. So all of this is called, generic term for it is shadow work. Shadow work. And I'll tell you, this has been a tough sell in the unity movement because, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, we tend to want to obsessively and exclusively focus on the positive. So conduct or behavior that we deny and repress comes back in ways that we don't recognize. And as I say, it's a tough sell for us because we don't want to look at those things. There's a book that I worked with here many years ago called Integral Spirituality by Ken Wilber. It's a wonderful, interesting, big book, but he has a whole chapter in this book, chapter 6, that's called The Shadow and the Disowned Self. Whole chapter devoted to this subject. And this is how the chapter opens. He says, "It's astonishing that I can deny I. That I can take parts of myself, my I-ness, and push them on the other side of the self boundary, attempting to deny ownership of those aspects of myself that are perhaps too negative to accept. Yet pushing them away does not actually get rid of them, but simply converts them into painful neurotic symptoms. Shadows of a disowned self come back to haunt me." Shadows of a disowned self come back to haunt me. Sounds like this should have been a Halloween talk, but if what he says is actually true, this is important information to have. This is important to know about, because if we know about it, we can be prepared to deal with it. And that, again, that's one of the tasks that we're facing when we begin to pursue a mature and truly transformative spiritual practice, the challenge of dealing with these shadow aspects. So quoting again from Ken Wilber, he says, "Those things in the world that most disturb and upset me about others are actually my own shadow qualities, which are now perceived as out there." Now, don't take that as a 100% hard and fast rule, but most of the time it's a good rule of thumb, and it's often a valuable clue that you're about to engage the shadow when you have a strong emotional reaction that is out of proportion to the reality of the moment. And if it's something that I've not actually done myself, then it's something that, if I'm honest with myself, I could imagine myself doing under the right circumstances. It's something I'm capable of, but I don't want to admit it. So, for example, getting cut off in traffic, right? Has anyone ever gone ballistic when you get cut off in traffic? You know, there's no real danger to yourself in these situations much of the time. You know, there's not an existential threat, but we go ballistic, and sometimes we will salute the other person for their performance with the single-digit high sign, right? So, when that happens, I would call that an out-of-proportion emotional reaction. And when that happens, it's a good idea to stop and think about, well, gee, have I ever done something like that? Or am I capable of doing something like that? And of course, when you ask if you've ever done that before, the answer is, of course I did. But, there's always a but. But that was different, right? I didn't mean it. It was an accident. I had to do it because someone cut me off, whatever. But not that guy. No, he did it because he's a jerk. And how do we know that? We don't. But the shadow always thinks it knows. It'll make up a story. It'll make up a story. So there's this myth that goes around in spiritual circles which says that spiritually advanced people don't need to do shadow work. It's a myth. In fact, the more spiritually advanced you are, the more you need to be on the lookout for the shadow. Especially spiritual teachers. It's very easy to put on the mask, the persona that says minister, priest, guru. And I know we've all heard the stories about what happens when spiritual teachers decide that they don't have to live by the rules that apply to everyone else. Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, it doesn't matter what faith or culture. The mask is used to cover the shadow, and when that happens, some kind of scandal is likely to follow. In fact, entire books have been written on the subject. The one that interests me the most is one that's called The Guru Papers. The Guru Papers. Look at the subtitle. Masks of Authoritarian power. And they outline all sorts of instances, every faith, every culture, including some New Age practices where this kind of stuff has happened. So it's important work to be done, and it's something that we can't avoid. We ought not to avoid. Now for those who admire Jesus as a great spiritual teacher, we need to remember that he did his own kind of shadow work. Okay? It's in the story about how he went out into the wilderness after his baptism, and he was tempted by the devil, right? We can interpret the devil in this situation as his shadow. And in fact, that's probably how the whole idea of Satan or the devil came into existence. It was human beings projecting their own negative aspects onto a supernatural being that they invented. Hey, it wasn't me. It was the devil that made me do it, right? Remember Flip Wilson? The devil made me do it. So in this story, the story about Jesus, he's being tempted to do some very egotistical things to show the world how powerful he was, and to gain admiration, and to gain power and possessions and things like that. And I find it fascinating that this story was left in the Bible, because it suggests that Jesus had to wrestle with this stuff just like the rest of us. And for a lot of folks out there, it's heresy to suggest that Jesus was anything less than perfect, that he still had this kind of work to do. Well, this story tells us that he still had to master the ego. He had shadow work to do. So, how does he handle it? Well, it's nothing dramatic. It doesn't turn into some kind of supernatural titanic battle between good and evil, like Jesus versus Satan in the cage match of the century or anything like that. Jesus doesn't declare war on it. He doesn't demonstrate hatred. He doesn't even demonstrate hostility. He simply speaks words of truth. He says, stop, leave me, you offer me nothing of value, and you have no power over me. Very simple. I see you, I know you're there, and I won't go along with what you want. That's all it takes. Try to kill it, and you just end up making the shadows of anger and violence even stronger. So it all starts with being willing to look at the situation, seeing it, engaging the shadow, and even if it's something that sneaks up on us, we can still work with it. We may miss the first opportunity to see it and say no, but that doesn't mean we give up and say, oh well, look what happened, too late to do anything about it now, right? We're not powerless. That's the first thing we have to affirm. We're not powerless. In the book, Richard Rohr calls this shadow boxing. I like that. It's shadow boxing. He says, we never get to the second half of life without major shadow boxing. And I am sorry to report that it continues until the end of life. The only difference being that you are no longer surprised by your surprises or so totally humiliated by your humiliations. Gets better. If we miss one opportunity for shadow boxing, there will always be another opportunity. And that's when we can start to use the same technique that we saw Jesus put into action. He used a format that we're all familiar with in Unity called denials and affirmations. That's what it was. Plain and simple. A denial is our way of saying no to something that we know is not true or not for our highest and best. Saying no to something that we don't want to take deeper root in consciousness. And it's a handy tool for dealing with the shadow stuff that comes up. Now people can get the wrong idea about denials. You've probably heard the expression, I think this is popular in 12-step programs, denial ain't a river in Egypt, right? They're referring to people who are trying to deny reality. And anytime we try to deny reality, we're engaging in something that we call metaphysical malpractice. Here's an example from our old friends Calvin and Hobbes. So here they're walking down the path, and Calvin says to Hobbes, I say a day without denial is a day you've got to face. And in the next frame, Calvin says, from now on, I'm not going to think about anything that's unpleasant. And Hobbes says, isn't that a pretty self-deceiving way to go through life? In the next frame, Calvin has a perplexed look on his face as he is pondering the wisdom of what Hobbes just told him. And finally he concludes, I'm not going to think about that. Yep, that's what I mean about using denial as a form of metaphysical malpractice. Using denial to avoid facing reality. Unhealthy denial means that we refuse to even acknowledge the appearance of something. For example, the common cold. I know it's getting to be cold season again, and we know that colds have unmistakable symptoms. Sore throat, chest, head congestion, headache, sneezing, coughing, runny nose. I sound like one of those commercials on TV, right? An unpleasant dose of reality, but there are still some old school unity folks who say that you shouldn't acknowledge the fact that you have a cold. You should never talk about it, name it, or describe the symptoms. Those are probably folks who've somehow not heard about germs and viruses, I guess. They sort of missed out on that one in science class. But you know, it's one thing to admit that the symptoms exist, and it's quite another to say that I'm powerless. See, that's the distinction. And there's a great example in a Unity book called The Quest. There's a section in there dealing with denials and affirmations. And the example they use is of a chain smoker trying to quit. Now, the smoker doesn't try to quit by saying, I don't smoke, or by saying, I don't crave a cigarette. He starts by acknowledging the appearance. It feels as if I need a cigarette. And then he follows that up with a denial. It feels as if I need a cigarette, but the truth is that I don't need cigarettes. Then he adds the affirmation. I have the power within me and around me to release them. I have the willpower, the intention, the mental and physical strength, plus maybe a nicotine patch or gum that can help with that. I can do all of these things. So, we're not going to ever deny the shadow stuff away, because that's how it got started in the first place, right? By trying to push it off and deny it. That doesn't work. What works is looking at it, seeing it, acknowledging it, and then calmly refusing to do what it wants. There we go. It's a double negative. That doesn't work. We calmly refuse to do what it wants. We affirm its existence. We affirm our ability to change course and not act on the shadow impulse, and we deny its power over us. It's important work. In fact, it's so important that I'm going to close with this quote from the book that describes the value of this kind of work. He says, one of the great surprises is that humans come to full consciousness precisely by shadowboxing, facing their own contradictions, and making friends with their own mistakes and failings. People who have had no inner struggles are invariably both superficial and uninteresting. We tend to endure them more than communicate with them because they have little to communicate. Shadow work is almost another name for falling upward. So we're going to pack that one away for next week, because we're not going to have our little gathering today to talk about this stuff. We're going to be gathering doing something else instead. Instead of talking about stuff, we're going to be stuffing our faces here in just a few minutes. So we'll take the subject up again next week when we wrap up the series, and tuck that little quote away if anybody wants to talk about it then. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Mike.